I've been thinking about simplicity. And as I was preparing to share with you this morning, I looked at my Testament of Devotion from Thomas Kelly and ran across the most wonderful phrase. It's in his chapter called The Eternal Now and Social Concerns. And he says, he's been talking about the divine love that is overall, under all, through everything we do. And he says, for each of us, these special undertakings are our share in the joyous burdens of love. Our share in the joyous burdens of love. When we think about the needs of this world and our place in them and what we can do, Thomas Kelly is very clear that we are not asked to do everything. That is not what God is put us on this earth to do. And that if we are remembering and living in God's eternal love and empowerment, that we will take up our own special undertaking as our share in this joyous burden of love that God has for everyone. So I'm going to read to you, I'm going to back up a little bit, and I want to share from Matthew, this very difficult set of words from Jesus, I think. And let's hold that in our minds as we think about simplicity this morning. This is from Matthew 6, starting in verse 25. And this is the one that says, don't worry about anything. What I noticed this time when I read this again, the very first word Jesus says in verse 25 is, therefore, I tell you. He has just given a very long Sermon on the Mount, and he has talked about all kinds of things. But what he's been talking about in chapter 6 is prayer and trust and the power of God and all these things that make our lives are encompassed with and supported by, and talks about the not storing up treasures on earth and your eye having clarity. If your eye has clarity, you can see. All those wonderful things come first. Having heard all of that and saying, that sounds good, I accept that. He says, therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and let your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And can any of you, by worshiping, add a single hour, by worrying, sorry, I thought that sounded wrong. Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your day or your span of life? And why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of them. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore, do not worry, saying, what will we eat? Or what will we drink? Or what will we wear? When I was a kid growing up in the Ann Arbor Friends meeting, simplicity was my least favorite testimony. Simplicity felt like the reason I shouldn't acquire and then enjoy wearing a new sweater that I, quote, didn't really need, or to delight in spending hours deciding which book to buy with my $15 Christmas money in crisp new $1 bills that my paternal grandpa sent me every year. It was 15 because I am the oldest of the grandchildren. I think I was supposed to give % of that gift to someone less fortunate than I, but somehow that never happened because the books I fell in love with were about horses with lots of photographs. And so I sometimes had to add some of my own allowance to make up the difference in price. This dislike of the testimony of simplicity followed me into and out of college. I went to the State University and lived in the Friends Co-op and delighted in sharing the chores of being in the community and going to meeting for worship in the spacious meeting room where friends attached to the three-story building which housed the co-op where I lived. And the quote problem with simplicity began to shape itself with a vengeance as quote, those friends who claimed to live a simple life and felt free to point out where and how I didn't measure up. I can still recapture my youthful indignation the day I went to the country home of one of the most vocal simplicityites of my monthly meeting and discovered the most wonderful outdoor swimming pool in the middle of her cement patio with water warm enough for us to swim. So that's why we were instructed to bring a bathing suit and towel with us in the middle of January. P.S. I love to swim. It was the only sport I was any good at, and having a pool of my own to swim in every day, no matter the weather, was at the top of my bucket list, second only to owning my own horse. My father was a professor at the University of Michigan. We lived in a big old house, but my sister and I shared a room, and we shared the workload with Mom in the summer to earn our weekly horseback riding hour. And we got a box of lovely, expensive hand-me-downs from our Philadelphia cousins every year, which I was too fat to fit into and which my sister looked elegant in. And Mom and I went to the department store to buy an outfit or two for school, and we ate leftovers, and we knew going to the drive-in for hamburgers and root beer, that's where the waitress hung a metal tray of food off the driver's partially open window, was a special treat. And yet I had the feeling this wasn't enough, that somehow I was supposed to be better at this simplicity stuff. And then someone gave me a copy of Thomas Kelly's Testament of Devotion. And as I read the chapter called The Simplification of Life, I encountered simplicity described in a way I longed to experience. He writes, if the Society of Friends has anything to say, it lies in this region primarily. Life is meant to be lived from a center, a divine center. Each one of us can live a life of such amazing power and peace and serenity, of integration and confidence and simplified multiplicity on one condition. That is, if we really want to. Kelly describes a life centered on and lived out of the divine center, returning from our busy lives over and over again to the living presence. He reminded me that, quote, we do need an hour or a half hour of quiet reading and relaxation, but I find that one can carry the recreating silences within oneself well nigh all the time, unquote. And after this quiet time, when you go out into the busy household, into the busy work world, whether working from home or the traditional place of business, you are able to stay in touch with the center, and no one need know about it. Kelly writes, there is a way of life so hid with Christ in God that in the midst of the day's business, one is inwardly lifting brief prayers, short ejaculations of praise, subdued whispers of adoration and of tender love to the beyond that is within. Life from the center is a life of unhurried peace and power. It is simple. It is serene. It is amazing. It is triumphant. It is radiant. It takes no time, but occupies all our time. And when our little day is done, we lie down quietly in peace, for all is well. The testament of simplicity was slowly becoming more attractive. Maybe it begins with living our lives from a center to whom we listen and commune and discern the next right step, task after task, decision after decision, big and small, life-changing and what's for supper, ordinariness. And then another wonderful someone introduced me to Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. And I made a beeline for his chapter on simplicity, where I discovered more ideas which spoke to my condition. I loved his distinction between asceticism and simplicity. Asceticism renounces possessions. Simplicity sets possessions in proper perspective. Foster writes, the inward reality of simplicity involves a life of joyful unconcern for possessions. It is an inner experience of trust. I read about the 3 inner attitudes that characterize, quote, freedom from anxiety, which Jesus talks about in Matthew 6, 25 to 33. 1, receive what we have as a gift from God. 2, know that it's God's business, not ours, to protect what we have. 3, make our goods available to others. I wrote in the margin in black ink, the pathway to unconditional generosity. From Richard Foster, I got in touch with what I already knew from my growing up in the activist, progressive community of the Ann Arbor Friends Meeting. The sheer fact that a person is living without things is no guarantee that he or she is living in simplicity. What was lacking in my understanding of the testimony of simplicity was supplied by the writings of these 2 friends, alongside my personal struggle with defining through my own eyes what a life of faithful obedience looks like for me, rather than reacting to the critical voices of others. Foster offers a series of quote principles to follow in our attempt to flesh out the meaning of simplicity for today. I will share a few of my favorites and direct you to the chapter on simplicity in his book for the rest of them. 1, buy things for their usefulness. 2, reject anything that is producing an addiction in you. And here's where Foster puts in a zinger for me anyway. This includes books. 3, develop a habit of giving things away. 4, learn to enjoy things without owning them. And 5, shun anything that distracts you from seeking first the kingdom of God. Simplicity begins as an inner attitude of trust in God's provision, which is expressed by how I use my time, my talent, and my treasure. I am now free to walk into a home without hauling out my internal checklist and taking an inventory of the owner's possessions by what's acceptable on some simplicity list and what is not. And best of all, I can do this in my own home. What a relief. The testimony of equality is still at the top of my list, but simplicity has moved into second place from a far removed and distant last. building on that article that I wrote, Kelly goes on to explore more thoroughly the idea that he is building, that simplicity in the way we live our lives is what the testimony of simplicity is about. Yes, it has a don't buy this, don't buy that, you know, you buy used clothing. I mean, that's all ways of interpreting that we can do as individuals. But for him, the basic starting place is with the divine center that he writes about. And that we can, if we are busy, if we have the divine center here and we are living our lives here as it is, and we're going to this committee and that committee and teaching this and doing that and cooking that meal and changing that diaper, all of these things keep us busy. And that's living in what we might call the secular world. And he says, dip down into that center over and over and over again. And one of the things I love about Kelly at this point is when he says, we can't be perfect at this. And if you wake up one morning and you say, you know, I promised I'd have 10 minutes of prayer every morning, and I haven't done this in a good 2 months, and you're beating yourself up, he says, stop and pray. Just do it. Don't rehearse. I didn't do it yesterday. I didn't do it the day before. Start over again and just stop and start. And so his image of our busyness, he says, as we remain in this center, as we have this center sort of with us throughout the day that we're touching base with, that we're going back into, and remembering that God is not requiring us to do it all. This phrase about finding our task, our place in carrying the burden of love that God has for everyone. I just love that image. I think I've told you this story before, but when I was so active in the peace movement back in the 80s, I was working for the American Baptist Church's state office in Granville. And one of the pastors said, you know what we all need to remember? As we go to bed at night, the peacemakers in Australia are just waking up. And I think that's a good thing to remember with anything we do. I mean, when I feel like I've got to do something about all the homeless in Wilmington, that's not God. So figuring out what is let me get his wording right, because I just love it. The special undertakings are our share in the joyous burdens of love. I love this. He talks about the authentic person as one who knows the tendering of the presence, a tendering which issues in the burden bearing, cross carrying, cavalry reenacting life. Against this cosmic suffering and cosmic responsibility, we must set the special relationship experienced in a concern. Now, friends talk about a concern. I have a concern to do this, I have a concern to do that. It brings these general suffering and cosmic responsibility we feel. For Quakers, concern particularizes this cosmic tenderness, and it brings to a definite and effective focus in some concrete task all the experience of love and responsibility, which might evaporate in its broad generality into vague yearnings for a golden paradise. George Lakey at the Westheimer on last Tuesday was talking about how you're this broad generality of climate change, this broad generality of the degradation of the environment, the broad generality of injustice is overwhelming and numbing, and you can't budge. And he was urging these students and the rest of us in the audience to pick something. And I think what Kelly would say is that it's the God-given thing. It's this concern, this sense you have that this is what I can do to bear this universal burden that addresses suffering. There are two ways in which a concern is a particularization. It is a particularization of the divine concern of God for all creation. God's love isn't just a diffused benevolence. As the eternal is the root and ground of all times, yet breaks into particular moments, so the infinite love is the ground of all creatures, the source of their existence, and it also knows a tender concern for each one and guides those who are sensitive to this tender care into a mutually supporting blessed fraternity. But it is a particularization of my responsibility also. In a world too vast and a lifetime too short for me to carry all responsibilities. My cosmic love, or the divine lover loving within me, cannot accomplish its full intent, which is universal saviorhood, within the limits of 70 years and 7. But the loving presence does not burden us equally with all things, but considerately puts upon each of us just a few central tasks as emphatic responsibilities. For each of us, these special undertakings are our share in the joyous burdens of love. Thus, the state of having a concern has a foreground and a background. In the foreground is the special task, uniquely illuminated, toward which we feel a special yearning and care. This is the concern as we usually talk about it or present it to the monthly meeting. But in the background is a second level or layer of universal concern for all the multitude of good things that need doing. Toward them all we feel kindly, but we are dismissed from active service in most of them. And we have an easy mind in the presence of desperately real needs, which are not our direct responsibility. We cannot die on every cross, nor are we expected to. Behind the foreground, behind the background, we may distinguish the ultimate background, which is the eternal concernedness of love. I think those are the sorts of things that Jesus is talking about in when he says, therefore. If you've thought about all this, if you've heard all this, if you've worked at living in a center and out of the center and remembering the Australians who are waking up in the morning and taking up the good causes, then you can live without anxiety and without worry. I think that Kelly he doesn't say that, but it feels to me like the therefore you don't need to worry is predicated on a lot of work on our part and a lot of meditation and openness and testings and leadings and discerning our particular burden in love.